Kieran Morris, 72 years old, returns from a 2-week trip visiting his brother in Arizona, only to find his belongings piled outside his own house. A note from his son reads, "Sorry, Dad, no space for you anymore." After decades of sacrifice raising 4 children alone after his wife died, this betrayal cuts deeper than anything. The house he worked his entire life for, now closed to him. If you are watching this from somewhere comfortable right now, give this video a like and subscribe to hear how I turn the tables on my ungrateful family. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it. I never thought my golden years would include being locked out of my own home by my flesh and blood. My name is Kieran Morris, and for 35 years, I worked as a mechanical engineer at Johnson Manufacturing. Hard work, reliability, and family were always my core values. When my beloved wife Sarah was diagnosed with aggressive breast cancer 25 years ago, our world shattered. She fought bravely but passed away just 14 months later, leaving me alone to raise our 4 children. Thomas, who was 16 at the time, Marie, who was 14, Daniel, who was 11, and little Jessica, who had just turned 9. Those early years without Sarah were incredibly difficult. I would wake up at 5 in the morning, prepare breakfast and lunches for all 4 kids, get them off to school, then work my shift at the plant. After my regular job, 3 nights a week I would take on freelance drafting projects to make ends meet. There were many nights I fell asleep at my desk, exhausted but determined that my children would never feel the financial strain of being in a single-parent household. As the children grew up, I made sure they all had the opportunity to attend college. Thomas, my eldest, always showed a keen interest in business management. He was sharp as a tack, just like his mother, and I could not have been prouder when he graduated with honors. I postponed my retirement by 5 years specifically to help pay for his MBA program. The sacrifice seemed worthwhile when he landed a prestigious position at a financial firm in the city. Thomas married Amanda 8 years ago. At first, she seemed pleasant enough, always complimenting my home and asking questions about family heirlooms. They had twins, Jackson and Emma, who became the light of my life. Every Sunday the entire family would gather at my house for dinner, a tradition I cherished as it kept us connected despite our busy lives. Last year, as I approached my 72nd birthday, Thomas suggested I transfer the deed of my house into his name. His argument seemed reasonable at the time. He explained it would protect the house from potential healthcare costs if I ever needed extended medical care, and it would simplify the inheritance process. Since Thomas had always been responsible with money and had promised to let me live there for the rest of my life, I agreed. We signed the papers with minimal fuss, though I did insist on a few protective clauses that my lawyer recommended. Thomas seemed slightly annoyed at these stipulations, but ultimately agreed. 2 weeks ago, Thomas insisted I should visit my brother Frank in Arizona. Frank had been inviting me for years, but I always found reasons to delay. This time, Thomas was unusually persistent. He even purchased the plane ticket as an early birthday gift and assured me he would take care of the house while I was gone. Now I understand why he was so eager to get me out of the way. The trip itself was wonderful. Frank and I reconnected, reminiscing about our childhood and catching up on decades of stories. We visited the Grand Canyon, something I had always wanted to do with Sarah. Standing at the edge of that magnificent natural wonder, I felt a sense of peace I had not experienced since she passed. Little did I know that while I was finding this moment of tranquility, my son was betraying me in the most fundamental way. During my 2 weeks away, Thomas called several times, always sounding distracted. When I asked about the house or the family, he would quickly change the subject or claim he needed to take another call. I dismissed my concerns, telling myself he was just busy with work and the twins. On my final day in Arizona, I purchased small gifts for everyone. A handcrafted turquoise bracelet for Marie, authentic southwestern hot sauce for Daniel, who loves spicy food, a beautiful dream catcher for Jessica, and special hand-painted toy cars for the twins. For Thomas and Amanda, I bought a rather expensive piece of Navajo pottery that I thought would look perfect in their dining room. I boarded the plane with excitement, looking forward to seeing my family and sharing stories from my trip. The taxi dropped me off in front of my house around 3 in the afternoon. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed something unusual on the front porch. At first I thought perhaps Thomas had ordered some packages that had been delivered while everyone was out. It was only as I got closer that I realized what I was seeing. My entire life, packed up in cardboard boxes and plastic bins, sitting exposed to the elements and neighborhood curiosity. I stood frozen on the sidewalk, staring at the pile of boxes. My mind could not process what I was seeing. The taxi driver asked if everything was all right, but I could barely respond. I paid him mechanically and slowly approached what had once been my home for over 40 years. Taped to the largest suitcase was a white envelope with my name written in Thomas's distinctive handwriting. My hands shook as I opened it. The note inside was brief and devastating. "Sorry, Dad. No space for you anymore. We need to renovate. Left you some money for a hotel until you figure things out." There was $500 in cash inside the envelope. $500 to compensate for throwing me out of the home I had spent my life paying for, the home where I had raised my children, the home that legally was still partially mine, because of those clauses I had insisted on. I tried the front door, but the locks had been changed. I stood there, knocking, then pounding, but no one answered. I called Thomas repeatedly, but the calls went straight to voicemail. I called Marie, Daniel, and Jessica, but none of them picked up either. It was as though my entire family had decided I no longer existed. As the reality of my situation began to sink in, I sank down onto the front steps, surrounded by the boxes containing what remained of my life. The beautiful pottery I had bought for Thomas and Amanda lay forgotten on the ground beside me. The afternoon sun beat down, highlighting how vulnerable and alone I truly was. Walter Jenkins, my neighbor from across the street, noticed me sitting there and came over. Walter and his wife Nancy had moved in about 15 years ago, and we had always maintained a friendly relationship, sharing tools and watching each other's houses during vacations. "Kieran? What on earth is happening? Are you moving?" Walter asked, his eyes taking in the boxes and my shell-shocked expression. I could barely form the words to explain. Walter listened in growing disbelief as I showed him the note and explained about the house transfer and my trip. "This is unbelievable," Walter said, his face reddening with anger. "They cannot do this to you. This is elder abuse." Walter immediately offered me his guest room until I could sort things out. His kindness was the only thing that prevented me from collapsing completely. Together, we loaded my belongings into his pickup truck and his garage, making several trips until everything was safely stored. That night, lying in Walter's guest bed, sleep eluded me completely. I kept replaying every interaction with Thomas and Amanda over the past year, looking for signs I had missed. There had been small moments, now that I thought about it. Amanda commenting that the house was outdated and needed a woman's touch. Thomas asking casual questions about my retirement savings and life insurance policies. Small criticisms about how I maintained the house or yard. But nothing that would have led me to expect this level of betrayal. Around 6 the next morning, my phone rang. It was Thomas. I answered immediately, my heart racing with a mixture of relief and anger. "Dad, I see you got back safely," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "Thomas, what is going on? Why are my things outside? Why have you changed the locks?" My voice cracked with emotion. There was a pause before he answered. "Dad, Amanda and I have been planning to renovate the house for months. We need the space for the twins as they grow. Your bedroom is going to become a proper playroom, and we are expanding the kitchen into your study. There simply is not space for you anymore." "But this is my house. We had an agreement," I protested. "The house is in my name now," Thomas replied coldly. "The agreement was informal. Besides, we found a very nice assisted living facility about 20 minutes away. The $500 should cover a few nights at a hotel until they have an opening for you." "Thomas, I do not need assisted living. I am perfectly capable of taking care of myself. How could you do this to me after everything I have done for you?" "Dad, you are getting older. It is only a matter of time before you need more care. This is the sensible solution for everyone. I have to go now. The contractors are arriving to start demolition on your old bathroom." He hung up before I could respond. I sat there, phone in hand, feeling as though I had been punched in the stomach. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, I began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, racking sobs that seemed to come from the very core of my being. Walter found me like that and simply put his hand on my shoulder, offering silent support until the storm of emotion had passed. After that devastating phone call, I tried to collect myself. Walter's wife Nancy brought me coffee and toast, but I could barely eat. My world had been upended so completely that even basic functions seemed difficult. However, as the initial shock began to fade, something else started to take its place. A slow, burning anger and determination began to form in my chest. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made for my children, especially Thomas. When Sarah died, I had been so consumed with grief that I could barely function. But I forced myself to keep going for the children. I took on a second job drafting blueprints at night after my regular engineering shift ended. For 3 years, I worked 70-hour weeks to make sure the kids could stay in the same school, continue their extracurricular activities, and not feel the financial impact of becoming a single-income household. I remembered the nights spent helping Thomas with his math homework, the weekends spent coaching his baseball teams, the proud moment watching him graduate high school as valedictorian. I recalled postponing my retirement specifically to help pay for his MBA program, putting my own dreams of traveling on hold because he had potential that I wanted to nurture. These memories strengthened my resolve. I asked Walter if I could use his home office to sort through the boxes containing my important papers. He agreed immediately, still outraged on my behalf. For the next several hours, I meticulously went through every financial and legal document I possessed. That was when I made 2 critical discoveries. First, while Thomas now owned the main house, I had never transferred ownership of our family vacation apartment. It was a modest 2-bedroom condo in a small lakeside community about 40 miles from the city. We had purchased it when the children were young, spending summers there fishing and swimming. After Sarah died, we visited less frequently, and in recent years it had stood mostly vacant, though I still maintained it and paid the association fees. The second discovery was even more significant. When transferring the house to Thomas, my lawyer had insisted on including several protective clauses. One of them stated that I retained the right to approve any structural changes or major renovations to the property for as long as I lived. Furthermore, if Thomas violated certain conditions, including the verbal agreement that I would have a home there for life, a legal review could be triggered that might revert ownership back to me. This clause had been a point of contention during the signing. Thomas had argued against it, but I had insisted, mostly to protect the architectural features of the house that Sarah had loved. Thomas had finally relented, probably assuming I would never contest any changes he wanted to make. Now, this overlooked legal detail might be my salvation. I immediately called my old friend Lloyd Peterson. Lloyd and I had worked together at Johnson Manufacturing for 20 years before he left to start his own legal practice focusing on elder law. We had stayed in touch, meeting for lunch every few months. Lloyd listened carefully to my situation, his professional demeanor barely concealing his outrage. "Kieran, what Thomas has done borders on elder abuse, especially if he used deception to get you to transfer the property. The good news is that the clause about approval for renovations gives us solid legal ground to stand on. Have they already begun the renovations?" "Thomas said contractors were arriving today to start demolition," I replied. "Perfect. We can file an immediate injunction to halt all construction, citing your legal right to approve changes. That will buy us time to explore our options more thoroughly." Lloyd also suggested I move into the vacation apartment immediately. It would provide me with a safe place to stay while we developed a strategy, and it would establish that I was still capable of independent living, countering any claims Thomas might make about my needing assisted care. By that evening, Walter had helped me move essential belongings to the lake apartment. It felt strange returning to this place that held so many family memories, now alone and under such circumstances. But it was clean, furnished, and most importantly, still mine. The next morning, Lloyd filed the injunction to halt renovations. By afternoon, I received a furious call from Thomas. "What the hell do you think you are doing?" he shouted. "We have contractors scheduled for the next 6 weeks. Do you have any idea how much this will cost us if we have to reschedule?" "Perhaps you should have considered that before throwing me out of my home," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "You had no right to file this injunction. The house is in my name." "Check the transfer agreement, Thomas. Section 7, Paragraph 3. I retained the right to approve any structural changes to the house. You cannot legally begin renovations without my written consent, which I am not giving." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, in a voice dripping with cold fury, Thomas said, "You will regret this, old man. You have no idea who you are dealing with." Then he hung up. His threat sent a chill down my spine, but it also strengthened my resolve. I had spent my entire life being reasonable, responsible, and selfless. Perhaps it was finally time to stand up for myself, even against my own son. Lloyd had already begun preparing more extensive legal documents, including a formal complaint about the improper eviction and a motion to review the property transfer based on Thomas's violation of our verbal agreement. That night, alone in the vacation apartment that now served as my refuge, I formulated a plan. Thomas had clearly underestimated me. He assumed I would quietly accept this betrayal and shuffle off to an assisted living facility. He had no idea that his father still had fight left in him and resources he had not accounted for. If he wanted a battle, I would give him one. Not out of vengeance, but out of a deep conviction that what he had done was profoundly wrong, not just legally, but morally. As I looked out over the darkened lake, watching the reflection of the moon ripple across its surface, I made a promise to myself. I would not only reclaim my dignity and my rightful place in my own home, but I would also teach my son the lesson about respect and family that he so clearly needed to learn. The next morning, I decided to reach out to my other children. Surely Marie, Daniel, and Jessica would be horrified by what Thomas had done and would support me. I called Marie first, as she had always been my most empathetic child. The phone rang several times before she answered, her voice guarded. "Dad, is everything okay? Thomas said you might be calling." My heart sank at her tone. "Marie, has Thomas told you what he did? He locked me out of the house while I was visiting Uncle Frank. All my belongings were piled outside when I got back." There was a pause before she replied. "Dad," Thomas explained everything. "He said you agreed to the assisted living arrangement before you left, but then got confused and upset when you returned. He says you have been getting more forgetful lately, and that this is really the best solution for everyone." I could not believe what I was hearing. "Marie, that is absolutely false. I never agreed to any such arrangement. Thomas is lying to you." "Dad, please calm down. Thomas said you might get agitated. He also said you filed some kind of legal motion against him? That seems really extreme. He is just trying to help you." "Marie, I filed an injunction because I have legal rights to that house that Thomas is violating. I am not confused or forgetful. Your brother threw me out of my own home and is now spreading lies about my mental state to cover his actions." "I do not know, Dad," Marie replied, her voice heavy with doubt. "Thomas has shown us emails where you discussed assisted living options, and you have seemed a bit confused on the phone lately. Maybe you just do not remember agreeing to this?" My conversations with Daniel and Jessica followed similar patterns. Thomas had clearly been working for weeks to convince my other children that I was experiencing cognitive decline. He had fabricated evidence, selectively shared conversations, and played on their concern for my well-being to manipulate them against me. By the end of the day, I felt utterly alone and betrayed, not just by Thomas but by all my children who had chosen to believe his lies over their own experiences with me. That afternoon, I visited my bank to withdraw some additional funds, only to discover another devastating blow. The joint account I shared with Thomas, which contained most of my retirement savings, had been emptied 2 days earlier. Thomas had transferred the entire balance, nearly $200,000, to an account in his name only. When I showed the bank manager the withdrawal slip with Thomas's signature, she expressed sympathy but explained that since it was a joint account, Thomas had every legal right to withdraw the funds. The accumulated stress and betrayal began to take a physical toll. That night, I experienced chest pains severe enough that I drove myself to the emergency room, fearing a heart attack. After several hours of tests, the doctor informed me it was not a heart attack but likely stress-induced angina. She prescribed medication and strongly advised reducing the stress in my life, a recommendation that seemed cruelly impossible given my circumstances. As I sat alone in the emergency room waiting for my discharge papers, it struck me that not one family member was there with me. In previous medical situations, I would have had at least one child rushing to be by my side. Now, I was truly alone. The nurse who processed my discharge seemed to sense my isolation and took extra time to explain the medication and follow-up procedures, her small kindness nearly bringing me to tears again. Over the next few days, more painful revelations emerged. Through Walter, who still lived across from my former home, I learned that Thomas and Amanda had been planning this move for months. They had consulted with contractors and interior designers well before suggesting I visit Arizona. Amanda had been telling neighbors that they were finally able to update that dated old house and specifically mentioned converting my bedroom into a state-of-the-art home gym, not a playroom for the twins as Thomas had claimed. Even more disturbing, Thomas had apparently told several neighbors that I was now residing in a wonderful retirement community and was so much happier there. He had effectively erased my existence from the neighborhood where I had lived for 4 decades, rewriting the narrative to cast himself as the dutiful son who had made the best arrangements for his aging father. The final betrayal came when Lloyd discovered, through his legal investigation, that Thomas was not simply renovating the house but had actually listed it for sale with a real estate agent. The listing, which Lloyd found online, described a soon-to-be fully renovated classic home in a desirable neighborhood and included digital mock-ups of what the house would look like after the extensive renovations. The asking price was nearly double what the house was currently worth, with Thomas clearly planning to profit enormously from the property he had manipulated from me. When Lloyd showed me the listing on his tablet, something inside me broke. This house was not just a financial asset to me. It was where Sarah and I had built our life together, where we had raised our children, where every corner held memories of laughter, tears, celebrations, and quiet everyday moments. The kitchen still had the height markings on the wall, where we had measured the children each birthday. The backyard held the oak tree we had planted when Thomas was born, now tall and strong. The study still contained Sarah's reading chair, where she had spent countless hours lost in her beloved novels before her illness took that pleasure from her. The thought of strangers walking through those rooms, tearing out the cabinets Sarah had chosen, painting over the walls where our family photos had hung, replacing the garden she had tenderly cultivated, was unbearable. This was not just about a house or money anymore. Thomas was attempting to erase our family history, to wipe away all physical traces of the life his mother and I had built. That night, sitting alone in the vacation apartment that now served as my refuge, I hit rock bottom emotionally. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully feel the magnitude of betrayal. My oldest son, whom I had loved and supported through every stage of his life, had coldly and calculatingly planned to dispose of me like an unwanted piece of furniture. He had lied to his siblings, manipulated legal documents, stolen my savings, and was now planning to profit from selling the family home out from under me. I sat on the small balcony overlooking the dark lake and wept, not just for myself but for what our family had become. The moonlight reflected off the water, reminding me of nights spent teaching the children to swim, of family barbecues on summer evenings, of Sarah laughing as she watched our children splash in the shallows. Those memories seemed to belong to another lifetime now, a reality that no longer existed. But as the first light of dawn broke over the lake, something shifted inside me. The crushing weight of betrayal and grief began to transform into something else. A quiet, steady determination took its place. I had spent my life solving problems as an engineer, approaching challenges methodically and finding solutions where others saw only obstacles. Perhaps it was time to apply those same skills to this situation, the most personal and painful challenge I had ever faced. As the sun rose fully over the lake, casting golden light across the water, I made a decision. Wallowing in hurt and betrayal would not solve my problems. It was time to take action, to fight back against the injustice that had been perpetrated against me. I may have been knocked down, but I was far from defeated. My first call was to Lloyd. I want to pursue every legal option available, I told him firmly. Thomas has gone too far, and I will not stand by and let him sell my home out from under me. Lloyd, always the consummate professional, suggested we meet in person to review all the documents and develop a comprehensive strategy. By 9 that morning, I was sitting in his downtown office, a thick folder of paperwork spread between us. The renovation clause gives us our strongest immediate leverage, Lloyd explained, pointing to the relevant section. But there are other aspects of the property transfer that may be vulnerable to legal challenge as well, especially given the evidence of deception. As we went through the documents line by line, additional legal advantages came to light. When I had helped Thomas with the down payment for his first house 15 years ago, we had documented it as a loan, not a gift. That loan, over $40,000, had never been repaid despite Thomas's promises. The paperwork included a clause that the debt would be forgiven upon my death, but since I was very much alive, it represented a significant financial obligation that Thomas was legally bound to honor. Furthermore, I had meticulously documented every improvement and major repair I had made to the house since transferring the deed. New roof, updated electrical system, modern energy-efficient windows, all paid for from my personal funds with Thomas's written acknowledgement. These improvements had significantly increased the property value, and under certain legal interpretations, could be considered an ownership stake in the property. "What Thomas has done borders on fraud," Lloyd said, his usual measured tone hardening. "The combination of the misleading statements to get you to transfer the property, the immediate violation of the verbal agreement about your continued residence, and now the attempt to sell the property without your knowledge or consent creates a compelling case for legal intervention." Over the next several days, we developed a multi-pronged strategy. First, Lloyd filed an additional emergency injunction to prevent any attempt to sell the house, citing the ongoing dispute over the property rights. Next, he prepared a formal legal complaint alleging fraud, elder financial abuse, and breach of contract to be filed if Thomas refused to negotiate a fair resolution. But I knew legal maneuvers alone would not be enough. This was also a family matter, and I needed to address the false narrative Thomas had created about my mental competence. I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Harrison, who had been my physician for over 20 years. After a thorough examination and cognitive assessment, he provided a formal letter stating unequivocally that I showed no signs of confusion, memory loss, or cognitive impairment of any kind. In fact, he noted that I was in exceptional health for a man of 72. Next, I contacted Walter and asked if he would be willing to provide a written statement about what he had witnessed the day I returned home to find my belongings outside. Walter agreed immediately, and even suggested that several other neighbors who had seen the situation might be willing to do the same. By the end of the week, I had 5 signed statements from neighbors attesting to my clarity of mind and the disturbing nature of my eviction. I also reached out to several longtime friends and former colleagues who could confirm my continued mental sharpness and independent functioning. My former supervisor at Johnson Manufacturing wrote a particularly powerful letter describing my problem-solving abilities and attention to detail during my final years before retirement, directly contradicting Thomas's claims of long-standing cognitive decline. While building this documentation, I also hired a private investigator, on Lloyd's recommendation, to document Thomas and Amanda's activities regarding the house. Within days, the investigator provided photographs of Thomas meeting with real estate agents and contractors, copies of the renovation plans that had been filed with the city, and even recordings of conversations with prospective buyers who had been told the house would be completely available within 60 days. The most difficult part of my counteroffensive was dealing with the financial situation. Thomas had effectively stolen my retirement savings by emptying our joint account. Lloyd filed an emergency petition with the court to freeze those funds pending resolution of our larger case, but in the meantime, I needed to establish financial independence. Fortunately, I had a separate, smaller retirement account that Thomas had not known about, and the vacation property had increased substantially in value over the years, giving me some equity to work with if necessary. With Lloyd's help, I organized all my financial records to demonstrate Thomas's misappropriation of funds. We documented every transaction, every contribution I had made to the joint account, and prepared a full accounting of what Thomas owed me, including the unpaid loan, my share of the house improvements, and the misappropriated retirement funds. The total came to nearly $300,000, a sum that would be difficult for even Thomas, with his well-paying job, to dismiss or repay quickly. Throughout this process, I maintained complete radio silence with Thomas. He called repeatedly, leaving increasingly angry messages demanding that I withdraw the injunctions and stop making trouble. I saved each message, as they further demonstrated his true character and intentions, but never responded. Let him wonder what I was doing. Let him grow increasingly uncomfortable as the days passed, without information about my plans. The final phase of my strategy involved the other children. Despite Thomas's manipulation, I believed that Marie, Daniel, and Jessica were fundamentally good people who had been deceived. I carefully drafted emails to each of them, not accusatory or emotional, but straightforward and factual. I attached copies of the relevant documents, including Dr. Harrison's assessment, the neighbor statements, and the evidence of Thomas's plans to sell the house. I did not ask them to take sides, but simply to consider the evidence and draw their own conclusions. By the 3rd week after my unceremonious eviction, all the pieces were in place. The legal injunctions were active, preventing both renovations and any sale of the house. The documentation of Thomas's deception and financial misconduct was comprehensive and compelling, and I had begun to rebuild communication with my other children, who were starting to question Thomas's version of events in light of the evidence I had provided. The time had come for the final confrontation. After consulting with Lloyd, I decided that a family meeting would be the most effective approach. I asked Marie to arrange it, suggesting that Thomas and Amanda might be more receptive if the invitation came from her rather than from me or my attorney. Marie, now harboring serious doubts about Thomas's actions, agreed to host the gathering at her home the following Sunday. To Thomas, I knew this would appear as a capitulation, an opportunity for him to pressure me face to face into accepting his terms. He would assume I was finally ready to sign whatever documents he presented, to formalize my banishment to assisted living and secure his complete control of the house and my remaining assets. He could not have been more wrong. As I prepared for the meeting, reviewing the documentation one last time with Lloyd, I felt a strange sense of calm. The hurt and betrayal were still there, but they had been channeled into something productive, a determination to right this wrong and restore not just my legal rights, but my dignity and position within the family. "Are you ready for this?" Lloyd asked as we finalized our approach the day before the meeting. I thought about Sarah, about how she would have reacted to this situation, about the values we had tried to instill in our children. "More than ready," I replied. "It is time Thomas learned that respect and honesty are not optional in this family, and that there are consequences for betrayal." Sunday arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine, nature's ironic contrast to the storm I knew was brewing. Lloyd picked me up from the lake apartment at 1:30, giving us time to review our strategy once more during the drive to Marie's house. We agreed that I would lead the conversation initially, with Lloyd remaining silent unless legal matters needed clarification. The documentation would speak for itself, and my calm, rational presentation would further disprove Thomas's claims about my mental state. We arrived at Marie's modest suburban home at precisely 2 o'clock. Through the front window, I could see that everyone else had already arrived. Marie's husband Jack was arranging chairs in the living room. Daniel and his wife Rachel stood in one corner, talking quietly. Jessica sat on the couch, looking uncomfortable and periodically checking her phone. And there, dominating the center of the room with their very presence, stood Thomas and Amanda, exuding an air of confident control. Lloyd and I exchanged a final glance before ringing the doorbell. "Remember," he said quietly, "no matter what is said, maintain your composure. That alone will contradict everything Thomas has claimed about you." Marie opened the door, her expression a mixture of relief and anxiety. "Dad," she said, hugging me briefly but warmly. Then her eyes widened slightly as she noticed Lloyd standing behind me. "You brought someone?" "This is Lloyd Peterson, my attorney," I replied calmly. Given the legal nature of some of the issues we need to discuss, I thought it would be helpful to have him present. Marie glanced nervously over her shoulder toward the living room, then nodded and stepped aside to let us enter. The moment Lloyd and I walked into the room, a visible change came over Thomas. His confident smile faltered, replaced by a flash of uncertainty and then quickly masked by irritation. Amanda's reaction was less controlled, her face darkening with anger as she recognized that this would not be the simple manipulation she had anticipated. "What is this?" Thomas demanded, gesturing toward Lloyd. "We agreed to a family meeting, not a legal ambush." "Actually," I replied evenly, "we agreed to discuss the situation regarding my home and future living arrangements. Since you have taken legal actions affecting my property and financial interests, it seemed prudent to have legal representation present, just as you would in any important business negotiation." Thomas started to respond, but Marie interjected, "Let us all sit down and talk calmly. That is why we are here, right?" We arranged ourselves around Marie's living room. I noted with interest that Daniel and Jessica positioned themselves closer to me than to Thomas, perhaps already sensing that something about his narrative did not align with the father they had known all their lives. "I will get right to the point," I began, my voice steady and clear. 3 weeks ago, I returned from Arizona to find that I had been locked out of my home, with my belongings piled outside. I received a note informing me that there was no space for me anymore, along with $500 to secure temporary accommodations. I removed the note from my folder and placed it on the coffee table, where everyone could see it. This was followed by the discovery that Thomas had emptied our joint bank account containing most of my retirement savings, approximately $200,000, without my knowledge or consent. Thomas shifted uncomfortably as the other siblings looked at him with surprise. Clearly, he had not shared this detail with them. When I contacted Thomas about these actions, I continued, he informed me that he and Amanda were renovating the house and that I should move into an assisted living facility. He also claimed that I had previously agreed to this arrangement but had become confused and forgotten about it due to alleged cognitive decline. I placed Dr. Harrison's medical assessment on the table next to the note. This is a comprehensive cognitive and physical evaluation from Dr. Harrison, conducted last week. It certifies that I show no signs of confusion, memory loss, or any form of cognitive impairment. In fact, Dr. Harrison notes that I am in excellent health for my age and fully capable of independent living. Thomas leaned forward, his face flushing. One doctor's opinion does not negate what we have all observed over the past year, Dad. You have been increasingly forgetful, sometimes confused about dates and events. We are just trying to make sure you are safe and properly cared for. That brings me to the next point, I replied, maintaining my calm demeanor. I have statements from 5 neighbors, including Walter Jenkins, who helped me move my belongings after finding me locked out, attesting to my clear mental state and the disturbing nature of my eviction. I added these documents to the growing pile on the table. Furthermore, I continued, I have statements from former colleagues and my supervisor at Johnson Manufacturing regarding my continued mental sharpness right through retirement. More papers joined the stack. Thomas's expression grew increasingly strained as he realized the thoroughness of my preparation. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You are twisting the situation. We discussed the renovation plans months ago. You agreed that the house needed updating and that it would be better for you to move into a community with people your own age and appropriate care. Did we discuss specific renovation plans, Thomas? Can you produce any documentation of these discussions or my supposed agreement? Because I certainly do not recall any such conversations, I challenged. Before Thomas could respond, Lloyd spoke for the first time. Mr. Morris, perhaps this would be a good time to address the legal aspects of the situation. At my nod, he opened his briefcase and extracted several documents. When Mr. Morris transferred the deed of the house to Thomas last year, the transfer included specific protective clauses, including one requiring Mr. Morris's written approval for any structural changes or major renovations to the property. Lloyd passed copies of the transfer agreement to each person in the room, with the relevant sections highlighted. Additionally, Lloyd continued in his measured, authoritative tone. There was a verbal agreement, witnessed by the attorney who handled the transfer, that Mr. Morris would continue to live in the house for the remainder of his life. This verbal agreement was referenced in the written documentation as a condition of the transfer. Thomas's face had gone from flushed to pale. He clearly had not expected this level of legal preparation. Finally, Lloyd said, placing one last document on the table, we have evidence that Thomas has not only begun unauthorized renovations in violation of the transfer agreement, but has actually listed the property for sale. He produced printouts of the real estate listing, complete with digitally rendered images of the proposed renovated property. This revelation elicited audible gasps from Marie and Jessica. Daniel leaned forward, his expression hardening as he examined the listing. "You are trying to sell Dad's house?" Daniel asked incredulously. "The house we all grew up in, without even discussing it with any of us?" Thomas shot an angry glance at his brother. "It is my house now, legally. I can do whatever I want with it." "Actually," Lloyd interjected smoothly, "that is not entirely accurate. The conditions in the transfer agreement and the evidence of misrepresentation create significant legal questions about the current ownership status. The injunctions currently in place prevent both renovations and any sale until these matters are resolved." There was a moment of tense silence as everyone absorbed this information. Then Amanda, who had remained uncharacteristically quiet until now, suddenly spoke up, her voice shrill with anger. "This is absurd! We have spent thousands on architectural plans and deposits for contractors. That outdated, musty old house needs a complete overhaul to have any decent market value. We already have interested buyers willing to pay nearly $700,000 once the renovations are complete. We are not going to let some sentimental attachment to peeling wallpaper and creaky floors ruin this opportunity." Her outburst hung in the air, revealing what Thomas had carefully avoided, stating directly, "This was never about my needs or the family's best interests. It was about profit, pure and simple." Marie turned to Thomas, her expression a mixture of disbelief and disgust. 700,000? You told me the renovations were about making the house safer and more comfortable for the twins. You never mentioned selling it. And you said Dad agreed to move to assisted living because he felt the house was becoming too much for him to manage, Jessica added, her voice trembling with emotion. You made it sound like it was his idea, that he wanted this change. Thomas's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling before our eyes. He tried to regain control, his business training evident in the way he straightened his posture and adopted a reasonable tone. Look, the house is a valuable asset that was not being utilized to its full potential. Dad is getting older and will eventually need care that will be expensive. Selling the property now, at the peak of the market, after strategic renovations, is the financially responsible decision. The proceeds would more than pay for the best assisted living facility in the area, with plenty left over to secure Dad's future care needs. And line your pockets in the process, Daniel said bluntly. Thomas glared at him. I am the one who has been managing Dad's finances and looking out for his interests all these years. The rest of you moved away, built your own lives. I have earned the right to make these decisions. That is enough, Thomas, I said, finally standing up. All eyes turned to me as I addressed my son and the entire family. I have listened to you talk about me as though I am already gone, as though my wishes and feelings do not matter, as though the home your mother and I built together is nothing but a financial asset to be liquidated. That stops today. I looked around at each of my children, making eye contact with each one in turn. I raised all of you to understand the importance of honesty, respect, and family. Sarah and I worked hard to provide a stable, loving home where you could grow and thrive. We taught you that family supports one another, that we stand together through difficult times. Turning back to Thomas, I continued, what you have done dishonors everything your mother and I tried to instill in you. You lied to your siblings. You manipulated legal documents. You threw me out of my home without warning or discussion. You attempted to steal my retirement savings. And you tried to sell the house where all of you grew up, the last physical space that still holds your mother's presence. Thomas started to speak, but I held up my hand. I am not finished. I want to be very clear about what happens next. You have two choices, Thomas. First option, you can immediately return my belongings to the house, restore my access, return the money you took from our joint account, and cancel all renovation and sale plans. We can then have a reasonable discussion about what modifications to the house might actually benefit the family, with my full involvement and approval as required by our legal agreement. I paused, letting that sink in before continuing. Second option, Lloyd proceeds with the legal complaint alleging fraud, elder abuse, and breach of contract. The court freezes all assets, including the house and the money you took, pending a full investigation and hearing. Given the documentation we have assembled, I believe we would prevail, but it would be a lengthy, expensive, and very public process that would damage your professional reputation and divide this family perhaps irreparably. The room was utterly silent. Even Amanda seemed stunned by the clarity and firmness of my ultimatum. I do not want to pursue the second option, I said, my voice softening slightly. Despite what has happened, you are my son, and I love you. I want to believe that you can recognize the gravity of your mistakes and make this right. But make no mistake, I will not be discarded and defrauded by my own child. I deserve better than that, and deep down, I believe you know it. Marie was the first to break the silence that followed. Dad is right, Thomas. What you did was wrong on every level. If Mom were here, she trailed off, emotion choking her words. She would be heartbroken, Jessica finished quietly. You know she would. Daniel stood up and moved to stand beside me, placing his hand on my shoulder in a clear gesture of support. I am with Dad on this. What you did was inexcusable, Thomas. It stops now. Thomas looked around the room, seeing that he had lost the support of his siblings. Even Amanda seemed to realize that they had overplayed their hand and were now cornered. His expression cycled rapidly through anger, calculation, and finally a grudging acceptance of reality. Fine, he said tightly. I will cancel the sale listing and the renovations. You can move back in. He reached for his phone, making a show of texting someone, presumably his real estate agent. "And the money you took?" I pressed. Thomas's jaw clenched. "I will transfer it back tomorrow. But we need to discuss a more permanent arrangement. The house is still legally in my name. We will discuss future arrangements once my belongings are returned, my access restored, and my funds returned in full," I replied firmly. "And any discussion will include Lloyd and will respect the legal conditions of the original transfer. Is that clear?" Thomas gave a curt nod, his expression still defiant but his posture conveying defeat. For the first time since this ordeal began, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The fight was not completely over, but a critical battle had been won. More importantly, the truth had been revealed, and the family dynamics forever altered by that revelation. As Lloyd and I prepared to leave, Marie hugged me tightly. "I am so sorry I doubted you, Dad," she whispered. "I should have known better." "We all should have," Daniel added, joining the embrace. Jessica wiped tears from her eyes as she too moved to hug me. "Will you forgive us?" Looking at my 3 younger children, I felt a surge of love and gratitude. "There is nothing to forgive," I told them. "Thomas is very persuasive, and you were concerned about my well-being. But perhaps in the future, talk to me directly about any concerns rather than discussing me as though I am not capable of participating in decisions about my own life." They nodded, appropriately chastened, but also clearly relieved that our relationship remained intact. Thomas and Amanda stood apart, their body language stiff and uncomfortable, already plotting their next move, I suspected. That would be a challenge for another day. For now, it was enough that I had reclaimed my agency, my dignity, and my rightful place in my family and my home. As Lloyd and I walked to his car, he gave me an approving nod. "You handled that masterfully, Kieran. Firm but fair, assertive without becoming aggressive." Thomas had no room to maneuver. "Thank you, Lloyd." "For everything," I said, meaning it sincerely. Without his guidance and support, this outcome would not have been possible. "It is not over yet," he cautioned as we drove away. "Thomas will comply with the immediate demands because he has no choice, but people like him do not change overnight. We will need to remain vigilant and make sure any new arrangements truly protect your interests." I nodded, watching Marie's house recede in the side mirror. "I know, but today was a good start. Today, I stood up for myself, and the truth prevailed. Sarah would be proud, and for the first time in weeks, I truly believed she would be." The days following the confrontation brought rapid changes. True to his word, albeit reluctantly, Thomas transferred the money back to a new account I had established. Lloyd had insisted on documentation of the transfer and confirmation from the bank before we proceeded with restoring my access to the house. By Wednesday afternoon, I stood in the foyer of my home once again, keys in hand, surveying the space that had nearly been taken from me. Some of the demolition work had already begun. The guest bathroom had been gutted, and sections of drywall had been removed in what had been my study. It would take time and money to restore these spaces, but the house was structurally sound and still fundamentally the home Sarah and I had built together. Walter and several other neighbors helped move my belongings back from his garage and the lake apartment. As we worked, many expressed their relief at seeing me return and shared how disturbed they had been by Thomas's actions and claims about my mental state. "We never believed it for a minute," Mildred Johnson from 2 doors down assured me as she helped arrange books back on my study shelves. "Anyone who has known you all these years could see you are sharp as a tack and fit as a fiddle." Their support touched me deeply and reinforced my decision to fight for my place in this community that had been my home for so many decades. Despite having secured my return to the house, I made a strategic decision not to move back in immediately. Instead, I divided my time between the lake apartment and the house, overseeing the repairs while maintaining my independence. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It demonstrated my continued capability to live independently. It prevented Thomas from claiming I had abandoned the property again, and it gave me time and space to process the emotional upheaval of recent events. Within 2 weeks, Lloyd had drafted and Thomas had signed a new, much more detailed legal agreement regarding the house. This agreement explicitly prohibited any renovations or modifications without my written approval, guaranteed my right to live in the house for the remainder of my life, required Thomas to maintain appropriate insurance and pay property taxes, and most importantly, established a trust to manage the property rather than relying solely on Thomas's goodwill. The trust included provisions for regular financial reviews and required consensus among all 4 siblings for any significant decisions affecting the property. Thomas signed the documents with barely concealed resentment. Amanda refused to attend the signing, a small blessing as her absence made the process less contentious. I harbored no illusions that Thomas had experienced a genuine change of heart. He was complying because the legal and family pressure left him no alternative, but the trust structure now provided protections that did not depend on his character or intentions. Rebuilding relationships with my other children proved both easier and more complex than I had anticipated. Marie, Daniel, and Jessica were genuinely remorseful about having believed Thomas's claims regarding my cognitive state. Each made efforts to reconnect, calling more frequently, visiting when possible, and including me more intentionally in family events and decisions. Jessica, my youngest, took particular initiative in repairing our bond. She began joining me at the lake apartment every other weekend, sometimes bringing her husband and children, other times coming alone for what she called father-daughter reconnection time. During one of these visits, she confessed through tears that she had harbored guilt for years about moving to another state for her career, feeling she had abandoned me after Sarah's death. "I should have been more present," she said as we sat on the small balcony overlooking the water. "If I had been around more, maybe I would have seen what Thomas was planning and could have stopped it." "You built the life your mother and I always wanted for you," I assured her. "Neither of us ever wanted you to feel obligated to structure your life around us. Your success and happiness were always the goal." These conversations with each of my children helped heal the wounds Thomas's actions had created, gradually restoring the trust and closeness we had once shared. Even more importantly, they established new, more balanced relationships based on mutual respect, rather than paternalistic concern on their part, or expected deference on mine. Thomas himself remained a more difficult challenge. For several weeks after the confrontation, he avoided direct communication with me, sending terse emails regarding house matters through Lloyd rather than speaking to me directly. Amanda maintained her distance as well, conspicuously absent from family gatherings that I attended. The turning point came, unexpectedly, through the twins. Jackson and Emma, now 7 years old, had been kept away from me during the conflict, presumably to prevent them from contradicting the narrative Thomas and Amanda had constructed about my mental state. But children have a way of cutting through adult complexities, and one Saturday morning, Thomas reluctantly brought them to the house at their insistent request to see their grandfather. Watching those 2 bright-faced children race through the front door and throw themselves into my arms with unrestrained joy broke something in Thomas. I saw it in his face as he stood awkwardly in the doorway, the careful emotional walls he had constructed crumbling slightly at the genuine affection between his children and the father he had tried to discard. "They have missed you," he said quietly, the first personal words he had spoken to me in weeks that were not filtered through lawyers or related to property matters. "I have missed them too," I replied, hugging the twins close. "They are always welcome here. So are you, Thomas." He did not respond directly to that invitation, but in the weeks that followed, a gradual, tentative thawing began. Thomas started bringing the twins for regular visits. Sometimes he would leave them with me for an hour or 2, but increasingly he would stay, sitting somewhat stiffly in the living room while the children showed me their school projects or told me about their activities. During one of these visits, after the twins had gone outside to play in the backyard, Thomas finally addressed what had happened. "I convinced myself it was for your own good," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "That you would be safer in a facility with proper care, that the house was too much for you to manage. But I know that wasn't the whole truth." "And what was the whole truth?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He sighed heavily. "Amanda and I overextended ourselves financially. The private school for the twins, the country club membership, the summer house in the Hamptons. The opportunity to renovate and flip this house for a substantial profit seemed like the perfect solution to our money problems." He paused, then added quietly, "I am not proud of how I handled it." It wasn't a full apology, but it was an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, a small step toward potential reconciliation. "Thank you for being honest," I replied. "That's a start." And it was a start, albeit a fragile one. The trust between us had been fundamentally broken and would take years to rebuild, if it ever could be fully restored. But for the sake of the twins and the larger family, we established a cautious, civil relationship that gradually evolved into something resembling respect, if not the easy closeness we had once shared. One of the most unexpected outcomes of this painful chapter was my own personal growth and discovery. Having faced the prospect of losing everything, I found myself reevaluating how I wanted to spend my remaining years. The lake apartment, initially just a refuge during the crisis, became a second home that I genuinely enjoyed. I began spending more time there, especially during summer months, reconnecting with the peaceful beauty of the lake that had brought our family so much joy in earlier years. I also discovered new interests and activities that I had never made time for during my working years. A community art center near the lake offered classes for seniors, and on a whim, I signed up for a watercolor painting course. To my surprise, I discovered a genuine talent and passion for capturing the changing moods of the lake on paper. By the following spring, I had several paintings displayed in a local gallery, a source of pride I had never anticipated. The most significant change, however, came in my approach to family relationships and financial matters. The painful experience with Thomas taught me the importance of maintaining independence, even while fostering close family bonds. I worked with Lloyd to create a comprehensive estate plan that balanced my desire to provide for my children with appropriate protections against potential misuse. Rather than transferring assets directly, we established trusts with clear guidelines and independent trustees, ensuring that my wishes would be respected while minimizing opportunities for conflict among my children after my passing. Perhaps most importantly, I established new traditions that brought the family together on more equal footing. The Sunday dinners that had once been held in my house now rotated among all our homes, including my lake apartment when weather permitted. These gatherings evolved into occasions where all generations contributed, with grandchildren helping to cook, adult children sharing, hosting responsibilities, and decision-making distributed rather than centralized with me as the patriarchal figure. During one such Sunday gathering at the lake apartment, nearly a year after the confrontation that had nearly torn our family apart, I looked around at my assembled family. Marie deep in conversation with her youngest about his college plans. Daniel and his wife setting the table together, laughing at some private joke. Jessica's husband teaching the younger grandchildren to skip stones on the lake's surface. Even Thomas and Amanda, though still somewhat reserved, engaged and present rather than plotting and manipulating. In that moment, I felt Sarah's presence strongly, as though she were standing beside me, witnessing this healing and transformation. The path to this moment had been painful beyond measure, but the family that emerged from that crucible was in many ways stronger and healthier than before. The old patterns of paternalism and dependency had been replaced by more balanced, respectful relationships between adults who valued each other's autonomy while maintaining loving connections. As the sun began to set over the lake, casting golden light across the water and illuminating the faces of my family, I silently thanked Sarah for the foundation she had helped build, strong enough to withstand even the severe test it had recently endured. And I recognized that sometimes the most painful betrayals can ultimately lead to growth and wisdom that would otherwise remain undiscovered. Life rarely follows the paths we expect or hope for. The deep betrayal by my oldest son was something I could never have anticipated or prepared for. Yet in facing that challenge, in refusing to be discarded or devalued, I discovered strengths I did not know I possessed and created a new chapter of life richer and more fulfilling than I could have imagined. If there is one lesson I would share from this experience, it is this: no matter your age or circumstances, you have the right and the ability to stand up for your dignity and worth. Family relationships should be built on mutual respect, not dominance or control. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and for those who would take advantage of you, is to firmly establish boundaries and require accountability. Have you ever faced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it, and what lessons did you take away from that experience? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, or you know someone who might benefit from hearing it, please like, subscribe, and share it with them. Remember that standing up for yourself is not selfish. It is necessary for healthy relationships and a fulfilling life. Thank you for listening, and may you find the strength to face whatever challenges come your way with dignity and courage.